so that more people who might call in, they don't disturb us with a bit. My name is Darinka Czischke, and I'm assistant professor at this faculty, at the Department of Management in the Built Environment. And I'm very, very happy to introduce and welcome today our guest, our guest, Raquel Rolnik. As you all have seen and know probably, Raquel is professor of architecture and urban planning at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And she is also a former UN rapporteur on adequate housing as a component to the right to an adequate standard of living and on the right to non-discrimination in this context. So her work has been recently highly influential on the whole debate about financialisation of housing that many of us are very much aware of in the context of our work, our studies. I followed Raquel's work, especially since we coincided at an event that it's mentioned at the beginning of her book. And we woke up to the headlines one day of a British tabloid saying, "How dare this Brazilian woman come over here to the UK to evaluate UK housing policy? How dare she?" Well, she dared, and it caused quite a stir. But I think it was a very, very important milestone in opening up the discussion, many discussions, not only about financialization, not only about the extreme neoliberal ideology that many of the governments, not only in the global north, but also in the global south, have towards homeownership and privatization of housing, commodification of housing, but also, personally, also as being born in the global south, myself, I think it's very symptomatic of the certain arrogance of some governments, of certain persuasions, in regarding who is able, who is qualified to comment, to have an opinion, to criticize this ideology. So I was very inspired when I heard Raquel. This was in the context where I was the director of an NGO dealing with housing across the world, so I was wearing a different hat. But ever since, I have the fortune to also collaborate with Raquel and another colleague, Professor Irene Molina from Uppsala University, in the publication of a special issue on housing policy issues in Latin America, but with a special emphasis in South America. So I wanted to also take this opportunity to promote this work. Some of the people sitting in this room have also been co-authors or authors of articles published in this special issue. And it was really a very, very interesting exercise being able to collaborate with Raquel and Irene in trying to bridge the divide between paradigms about housing between the global north and the global south. So this is what I think is interesting of today. We have assembled a very interesting cast of professors from our faculty, at different departments, so from different perspectives. I will introduce them after Raquel's lecture, because we're going to have a panel discussion to try to reflect on Raquel's work from all these different perspectives, disciplinary perspectives, but also geographical perspectives. We're going to try to make sense of this phenomena across these divides. So without further ado, I now give the floor to our guest, Raquel.
So good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming, and thanks for Professor Darinka and Maria and all the staff of the School of Architecture for this great opportunity to share with you the presentation of my newest book, Urban Warfare, housing under the empire of finance, which is basically what I'm going to try to present today. But of course, I won't tell you all the content of the book because I want you to buy it, and the reason was available afterwards. So
yes. It's available from the bookstore now. You can buy it.
So yeah, so it's just I'm kidding. The book then I will present. There are several parts, and of course it will be impossible to present everything today. And as Darinka has pointed out, this book was a result of my personal experience as an urban planning, as a housing and urban policy researcher and professor, but also as a practitioner, having had different positions in local and national government of Brazil related to housing, and also several consultancies to different cities and Latin American countries for some time, and for UN Habitat for some time as well. But what the content, the empirical base of the book was basically what I was able to gather during my mandate of Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing for UN, which was based 6 years mandate, in which, as a Special Rapporteur, my main task was to receive complaints on violations of the right to adequate housing, investigate them, and then present a report back to the Human Rights Council. But this is theory, because of course there is the Special Rapporteur is one person with one assistant, a voluntary position, not paid, full-time paid assistant based in Geneva, and I was living in Sao Paulo. So without really the means to fully investigate any complaint, because there were complaints coming from everywhere, every day, and mostly related to evictions and displacements. But having said that, as rapporteur, I had the obligation to present once a year a thematic report on the topic to the UN General Assembly. So in order to do that, I had to research and use different information coming from different countries. But also, we had the possibility and the resources to do 2 missions a year to countries, which means 2 visits to specific countries a year, which means 13 visits as a whole I have done, because I included, and you're going to see why, the World Bank as one of my visits. And during the visit, and this is the most important and interesting, I would say, research issue about this role, we were able to meet with authorities, with officials, and having access to official documents, and doing visits with local governments, in the parliament, in the judiciary. But also we were able to have a totally separate part of the mission with NGOs, social movements, housing activists, visiting people in their homes, in their settlements, talking to them, and also with academics and people that were thinking on the topic of housing. So that was a very, very fruitful source of information on the present housing condition of each country, on the policies that were in place, housing policies that were in place, but also on the impact on those policies on everyday life, and especially, of course, on the lives of the most vulnerable parts of society. So because my mandate started in 2008, and again, in principle, housing mandate related to the UN was mostly focused in the Global South, where the most precarious housing conditions are. So most of the work was supposed to be focused on cities of the Global South, but I had the chance, and the people had the very bad chance, that in the first year of the mandate, the financial crisis burst. And the financial crisis was a mortgage crisis, was a housing crisis, and that provoked a housing crisis in several countries. So because of that, I started to investigate the origins of the financial crisis, the origins of the mortgage crisis, and then a research hypothesis came out, which I followed throughout my mandate and in different visits and in different missions, which is the fact that we are witnessing a new colonial empire which is faceless and flagless and is seizing territories and reshaping cities, and housing included, but not only housing. And the name of this new empire is global finance. It's a global process. It's, I would say, deterritorialized. It's abstract. It's fiction. Is speculative, because finance is speculative by nature. The nature of finance is betting on future value that can come out of the instruments. But it's a process in which space or build space, it has a very, very key and important role. So that I will try to develop a little bit more. And it's global, so we can see that everywhere, literally everywhere. But like all other experiences of colonialism, each locality has a particular unique expression. Each locality, each country, but also almost each city, each territory has a very particular story of how the financialization of the built space happened there. And also depending on path-dependent political economies of land and housing that existed before, political actors involved. So we are talking about completely different situations, completely different meanings, but the same process, which is the taking over of building spaces by finance. We could talk about these global processes in several ways. I think that a good way to start talking about that is when we see, especially in School of Architecture like here, those rent-seeking landscapes made of shopping malls, corporate towers, international brands, hotels, cultural centers, mega-designed cultural centers, which reproduce themselves in different cities, claiming to be very unique, but being literally very much the same type of landscape. And I have this story about that, because as a rapporteur I had to travel a lot, and of course travel overseas make you feel very, very exhausted. And one day I arrived, and it was Jakarta, and after a very, very long flight, and I'm crossing from the airport to the hotel, and I see these glass corporate towers, these shopping malls, these international brands there, and I was looking at it, I said, oh my God, where I am? Am I in Chicago? Am I in Dubai? Am I in, no, I was in Jakarta, but it doesn't make any difference. So what happened? Epidemics of lack of imagination of architects and urban planners? No, we are talking about specific morphologies that have to do with the specific products that are priced in the international financial market of real estate. So we are talking about a new animal, and this new animal calls real estate financial complex, in which it's not real estate, it's not finances, it's the two of them together. So what is that? What is the real estate financial complex? And I cannot develop that here. There is a lot of literature on that now. But basically, we have a huge electronic cloud, a kind of wall of fiction money floating around the planet without any barrier, because part of the new liberal measures that we're taking at economic level, macroeconomic level, in every country of the planet after the fall of the Berlin Wall, was the liberating of the possibility for financial capital to circulate and park in different places without barriers, including more and more up on the countries in tax havens, without even having to pay any tax in order to circulate in the country. So for this electronic cloud, which is huge, it's made of the sovereign funds of the countries, insurance companies, pension funds, our poor savings that are in the financial market being used as the same thing, as the same way, surplus capital of corporation. Can you believe, like a corporation like Apple, their money, 99% of their money is floating in the financial market and not being mobilized to produce the laptops and the mobiles, or not even invested in researching new technologies. I'm talking about 99% of the money circulating, and Apple's money and Apple's amount of money invested in financial capital is larger than the treasure of Germany. So, I mean, it's a lot of money, believe me, that is there. And why is this money there? The money, the financial money, and we know that empirically, what we need for our savings. We need interest on our savings to make them bigger. To do what? To make them bigger. To do what? To make them bigger. So basically, of course, not in our case, we're going to use this money, I don't know, to buy a house, to buy something, to invest in something. But for corporations, for sovereign funds, for all that, their main unique goal is to have more interest, to be bigger. So I think this is very important, because they are always looking for new outlets in order to go down, to park, and extract value and extract interest. So different fields, we know the stories, education, health, but built space is a very important part of it. So here we're going to talk, we could talk about more general real estate investment, but we want to talk about them through the lenses of housing, of course related to urban policy, which actively have created the material, symbolic, and normative conditions for the capture of lived territories, and so about the global process of dispossession, interrogating also who and where are the dispossessed and displaced, but also a little bit about their forms and tactics of emplacement, resisting displacements. As I told you, and again, I'm talking about active creation of the conditions, because it would be impossible the taking over of territories, by the empire of fairness without the active role of governments, including local governments, to attract and to be possible for them to extract value from built space and transform built space, which is the most important thing. So, as I told you throughout my mandate of Special Rapporteur, I could witness the effects of the financial crisis of 2008. So basically, the promise of financialization and marketization of housing was that finally everybody will have access to housing through the market. That will be the solution, the inclusionary solution for all. And as we know, empirically, this is a lie. This is a failure. Because what happened was, and I can tell you what happened in different situations. For instance, in the US, Spain, Ireland, foreclosure, people that really invested their savings and lives into buying, into going to that schemes through credit, through indebtedness, and then they just lost their homes and are homeless, basically. And they are homeless in a situation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that, in which there is no other option for, so there is no other policy in place in order to address homelessness. The only policy is go to the market, get a loan, and buy your home. This is the policy. There is no other option, so that's why it's a failure without an exit arrow to it. But that was clear, of course, in my mission in the US, with the amount of people that were affected for that. And but in a country like Kazakhstan, where I was there in mission, not expecting to have a mission related to housing, that was not the reason where I went there, and I arrived in Kazakhstan, and first day I see a hunger strike of people that have put all their savings in buying homes and apartments that were being offered and built by Turkish construction companies with European money from Germany and Netherlands and other European countries. And then because of the financial crisis, all this capital fled out from the construction companies. They were bankrupt, and the people were homeless in the middle of the street, without homes, without savings, and pressing the government for some solution. That's the hunger strike in Kazakhstan. And a lot of other places. And when I present my first report on the financialization of housing, trying to bring this to the arena of the human rights and saying, here we have violations of the human right to housing, I was invited to present the report to Spain, and then Spain, a whole new social movement around staying put, not being out because of foreclosures were going on, the PAN, Plataforma de los Afectados por las Hipotecas. And that could go on and on and on. So what was basically we were witnessing all over, and I went to Croatia, I went to different countries, and again, that was what I was seeing there, is the dismantling of housing as a social policy, as part of the dismantling of the welfare state, housing as a human right, into housing as a commodity and as a financial asset, actively promoted by the states with different strategies. And in the book I described a lot of the different strategies, and I basically grouped them in three. The mortgage one, which is more common in the northern, I don't like this north-south, but I mean, there is no other quick definition available. So it's more in Europe, in the United States, this mortgage model, but then there is also the subsidies model, which is more related to the South, and finally microfinance also, as part of financialization of housing. So how that happened? Massive privatization of public housing. That was the case, for instance, of UK and Eastern Europe, where super huge stock of social housing existed before. In UK, 40% of the total residential stock of UK by the end of the 60s was social housing. So it's huge. Now it became less than 18%. So it was privatized, but tricky, it was privatized to the city tenants with great discounts. So that was the miracle that can help us to explain two things. First, how Margaret Thatcher and the Conservatives got to enter into the Labour Party constituency and got support. And second, how was possible for the UK to keep some growth indexes in a time where wages were dropping radically under Margaret Thatcher? Yes, the success story was almost granting for the working class the homes as an asset and then use them, as L'Oreal Rubini good definition, as an ATM machine. You go there with your home, with your home ownership, and you get loans to finance your consumption, to pay the university of your children, in the case of the US, to pay private health systems and things like that. So that was the political economy of privatization. The political economy of privatization of the stock in Croatia had completely different meaning. It was a means for the Croatian government to have money to buy firearms to struggle against Serbia for independence in the 90s. So that was the rationale behind privatization. So in each place was very different. Could be eventually not massive privatization of social housing, but financialization of social housing providers. So this is more the case of Netherlands and Germany, that social housing providers that used to receive a lot of subsidies in order to be able to offer social housing, they were pushed towards financial market to be able to have the funds. So market, financial market means interest, means more money, means at the end of the day, larger rent, to increase the rents and to be more market-oriented and not social-oriented with their stock. So this is a different way of doing the same thing. But talking a little bit about the South and the Southern model, I can use the example of Chile, of Mexico, of Brazil, of South Africa, of having very good examples of how that happened. And in the third part of the book, I analyze much more the example of Brazil, and in order to answer the question, how was possible for Brazil to get into the financialization of housing under a government that was in principle anti-neoliberal? And I won't answer that, so again, that's in the book. But I can tell you what is the prevalent model of all those countries, which was, since most of the people that don't have homes and live in self-built communities, campamentos, favelas, bastis, kampungs, you name it. Now they don't have the resources to get into the credit and get into the market, so the solution is the government give you money in the form of subsidies for you to be able to get into the credit and the market and to buy homes produced by the private sector, basically. So this is the way, and this is the version of financialization and why it's financialized in a way, because in all of these cases, especially in the case of Chile, from the presence of these very poor, and that places became the playground for these rent-skipping landscapes, towers, shopping malls, very much design museums and cultural centers. So this is more or less the connection also between a housing policy and an urban policy at the same time, which had really provoked massive displacement. This is also true in the case of the very, very wide suburbanization of Spanish cities, Spanish big cities. So yeah, we are talking about the process of geographic restructuring, expansion of borders. I mean, this is not new in history, come on. Finance related to infrastructure building for massive production of real estate. It's an old story. And also the fact that the famous spatial fix theory, that you need to burn, when you have excess of capital, you need to burn it, and the best way to burn it is either you promote a war or you build new infrastructures and you build spaces, because this way you can mobilize a lot of capital, but also increase productivity of capital, renew the pace and speed of capital circulation. So this is an old thing. I mean, this is Haussmann Paris, basically. There is a famous book of David Harvey describing that. So what's new about the process that I am talking about now is that what is new is, first of all, the scale. The amount of financial capital which is available, and the velocity, the speed in which this capital can be assembled and mobilized with a bit, because of the digital revolution. And all of that became very quick and quickly moving around the world. So to assemble finances, to invest, to go in, to go out, is very quick. This is one thing. And then again, spaces are not just one more frontier to the wall of money to go down, but they have a fundamental role on that. Why they have a fundamental role? For two reasons. One, it's because the materiality of built space. So here again, we can remember the words of our grandmothers, maybe grandfathers, saying, if you have money, you put in built space, because contrary to any other investment, it will not disappear. It will be there forever, or for decades to come. So this is one characteristic of space, duration. And the other characteristics is built space property can be collateral. Then again, if we go to a bank and we ask for a loan, the first question the bank manager will ask you is, do you have any property, any apartment, any home to be here as a collateral? So can you believe if we do that at an individual basis, very tiny basis, so think on big investment funds and corporations with a lot of money, they use frequently build space as collateral in order to leverage their ability to raise money from the banks, because this is all about financial operation. That's one of the reasons why, and this is tricky, build space does, under financialization, does not necessarily need to be used. Can be empty and still be very functional to those investment actors as a collateral in order to raise the leverage, their capacity of borrowing money. Because I tell you again a story, a story also on the travels. I was passing through Dubai and I was seeing all these towers, and I realized that most of the spaces are empty. And by the time I thought, I was so ignorant, I thought, oh, poor developer. He must be bankrupt. He could not sell. Nobody is buying this, and it's empty, so it will be a disaster. No! It's the biggest success. It's empty, and it's a big success, because the whole idea is not exactly to buy and sell, and somebody will use, and no. The whole idea is the cost of money that you use in order to build, regarding to the cost of money that is another place, and using that on the books. So finally, build space can exist on the books. But there is a materiality linked to build space. So how can financialization deal with that? Transforming build space into an asset, into something which is very abstract and fiction. And again, architecture is very tectonic. It's very, in Spanish, I love the word in Spanish for real estate, is bienes raíces. It's goods that have roots. So they are rooted there. So how come it's possible for something that is very rooted to circulate freely in a market that needs to circulate very freely? So the magic was, and this is again the difference between the old spatial fix and the new spatial fix now, which is titularization, securitization. The fact that you can have a title to represent the space, and you can enter as an investor, and you can exit the build space as an investor without changing property, without really passing through the notary things, the property things. So a lot of new instruments were created in order for that to be possible, and one of these is, for instance, real estate investment trusts, real estate investment funds, where you can have quotas that give you the right to have a share of the yield, of the interest on that space, without necessarily being the owner of that space. Shopping malls are basically one of good examples. But that was completely widened over build space. Again, all of that happened since late 70s, and depending on each country, could happen in the 80s, in the 90s, in early 2000. But what states have done in order to offer their territories to financial capital as assets, basically. So they are dismantling social housing policies. They were redirecting public funds towards home ownership. Again, second lie of this neoliberal policy was that all states are completely running out of money, so we need private capital to come, otherwise it will be impossible to do anything. So we have fiscal austerity measures, we cut subsidies, we cut state funds to fund social equipment, social housing, and so on. But, attention, a lot of public money is involved in those private market operations through, first, tax exemptions. So the whole issue of home ownership in the US, which is huge, if you buy a home, despite your income, you are exempted from tax. So tax exemption is public money, basically. Other measures, I just passed through Manchester that was so clear, using public land to public-private partnership, offering public land to public-private partnership development to happen that was directed to real estate financial complex. And under the justification, and this is, I would say, the second big slogan that was disseminated all around. The first one, housing enabling markets to work, and this is the title of a very influential World Bank book that was disseminating all over. And the second one, again, World Bank, unlock land value. Unlock land value means that how come this very valuable location, which can provide a lot of interest for the invested capital, is used by low-income people, commercial, very low-income commercial shops, public housing. So that was the base for planning strategies that were constantly either demolishing public housing from well-located places, cleaning up this public land from other type of uses and presenting them. So part of the famous urban renewal schemes that are so important and famous in planning in the 80s and 90s are pure unlock land value operations. Why? Because, and here I share with you a metaphor which I think is the best one for me to define this type of development, because they eventually have some affordable housing or low-income housing. Their public spaces are the ones that are, we have new public spaces and they are great. But what we see in those cases, and I have researched a lot different cases in different countries, and Porto Maravilha in Rio de Janeiro is one of the cases, is that it's like, I have to tell you this story. When I was students in the School of Architecture in Sao Paulo in the 70s, students were very rebel. We rebelled against everything, and we rebelled against the assignments of the professors. So the professors assigned something, I don't want to suggest anything here, okay? But the professors assigned, the industrial design professors assigned us to design new objects for industrial design, and we decided, our class decided not to do that, and to promote as an assignment useless objects, only useless objects, and to do an exhibition of useless objects. And we have done that, and my favorite work that was presented there, it was not mine, but I love it, was a huge elephant made of papier-mâché, very, very big, with a little duster in the tail. So something absolutely useless as a duster, because how can you move? And those are the public-private partnerships development projects. That's my definition. The elephant is corporate towers, shopping malls, blah, 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 and the little duster is the number of social housing which is being attached to it and gained through it. And this is basically what is happening everywhere. But also states were not only unlocking land values in planning schemes to unlock land value, but also reforming. And the whole second part of the book is devoted to land reforms that were implemented basically in the Global South in order to be able of the territory which had not private property relations through titularization programs to be part of commodification and also to implement the hegemony of private property and home ownership as the one and only model that should be the one and only relationship between people and territories. So I'm going to come back to that, and I'm going to finalize elaborating a little bit on that. But I think that the promotion of access to housing through credit was basically the transfer of debt from state to the families and the liberation of territories to open new frontiers. And that resulted in crises everywhere and resulted including in regression of housing rights in places where used to have significant housing policy for the residents. But then what happened in the countries that never had a housing policy, a significant housing policy for everywhere? So even in those cases, the idea of promoting homeownership have been very, very powerful. And it was used and mobilized, as I told you, to destroy and displace places like campamentos, which was also a political issue because campamentos were the basis for Allende during the dictatorship of Pinochet, towards the so-called highest and best use in the city, but also to create this kind of an orderly market of homeowners for the poor. And so there are multiple dimensions of this other. So the other is the parts of the city which in most of the cities are the majority of the city that are not really into this game, or they are not displaced, they have not been displaced, they are not living in a new quarter. So I elaborate a little bit on that. Why? Because the essential condition for space to circulate freely in the global markets is, as I said, one and only permitted form of relationship of individuals with territories, which is private property. And that was the base to deny the existence and control of territories. So there is a history of land grabbing, of colonial land grabbing around there. So why I'm saying that? Because, okay, private property and a democracy of property holders was a revolutionary utopia that started 250 years ago. But why this is the one and only model? It has been one of the ways in which peoples have links to the territories they used to live. Just one. And very recent, by the way, only 250 years from now. But became hegemonic, it was, thought in the Enlightenment as a juridico-political form, the democracy of freeholders. So property, freedom, and citizenship became very intermingled together, but that also became the base for planning. The base for planning, which is basically, I design the place where private property can be, and I design the place where public property is there. And public property has been over time, and especially since the 19th century, the definition of public properties has been more and more like a private property of the government. And the privatization process made it so clear when states decided to sell. It's my private property, I sell them. And not as common, really common spaces, which was the very, very origin of public space. And I think that we should rethink and retake that idea. In colonized territories, planning was never able to transform completely the city. Never. But planning is able and very powerful in setting the borderline between what is legal and illegal, what is in and what is out. So we are talking about those landscapes for life, which are self-built neighborhoods produced under scarce resources, with no material and technical support of the state, favelas, bastions, campos, slums, a spatiality marked by the logic of life, which has been identified as outcast and marginal despite being the majority, despite being most of the territories, under a very discriminatory gestalt in which planning offers the language and the instruments to build. So what I'm arguing here, that planning was never able to really change everything, but was able to set the borders, and those borders are super significant from a political point of view, because yes, if you are everyday life, although it's in principle illegal, or informal, I hate this word, how a form can be informal. But illegal. But despite being illegal, all the slum dwellers are not in jail. So everyday life, what is there is the ambiguity. The ambiguity and the permanent transitoriness of the conditions that opens the ground for, in one hand, if you need very cheap land to open up for the real estate financial complex, this is the place, because you don't pay expropriation for the people. But again, this is small. This is not the big thing. This happened a lot, and part of the evictions related to mega sport events and things like that are related to that. But every day the ambiguity creates a sort of state of exception. State of exception where services there could be not exactly the same as the rest of the city. Behavior of the state there, instead of being social provider with good quality, is more repressing, criminalization, the police, and makes and opens ground for a situation where we have now in Brazil, in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, that in those particular neighborhoods, seeking for drug traffickers, the police just come shooting randomly and people get killed. So genocide policies, and they don't do that when they go to middle-class neighborhoods looking for drug traffic dealers and gangs. And we had this last week in Sao Paulo, a investigation led to an apartment in a middle-class neighborhood where there was a lot of cocaine and heroin and all that. But I'm sure the police, to get there, didn't arrive in the apartment and in the streets of this middle-class neighborhood just shooting randomly. And who defines where the police can do that? Criminalized, those racialized bodies. It's the borders of planning and planning language. So that's why I think it's so important to retake that. And now I'm back to financialization, just to finish my talk here. The first wave of financialization is related to home ownership and credit, as I told you. Now we have a new wave of financialization after the financial crisis, and this is the last part of the book, the post-phase of the book that I just wrote, which is rental housing. Global corporate landlords coming to control the stock of housing and put them into rent. That happened through several different instruments, like the same investment managers that provoked the financial crisis, for instance, in the US and Spain, they came and bought the foreclosed homes for a very low price, and now they have monopoly of a lot of homes and they are putting to rent. Some of the toxic assets of the banks were also sold to them. The toxic asset means the loans that clearly the people cannot pay back, so that happened also a lot. And there is other, I won't have time to develop, other new ways of financialization of rental housing. Airbnb is one of them, very, very clearly. I mean, shared economy, haha. Most of Airbnb is really a way of structuring rent and have a the financial platform is the one who plays in the financial market. Student housing, it was one of the ways in which global corporate landlords have entered into the markets, and then setting new prices for rentals, and people are not able anymore to pay rent in their own cities. So again, this new wave. If I finish here, I think it's very dystopian because we're talking about a powerful force that is really, really ruling and hegemonic. But it's important to say that this implementation of this model does not occur without political and social battles and several forms of resistance to prevent mega developments, to resist against social policies reformed and things like that, to organize, to stay put, to not being displaced. But what I would say is that since the whole idea is to use space as an asset, all the forms that we have, all the emplacements that we have that are not organized under this logic, they are resistance today. They are, I'm talking about cooperative housing, I'm talking about community land trusts, I'm talking about squatter buildings, I'm talking about all forms of having territories under control without the link with the financial markets. They are very important because in this urban warfare, they are a kind of liberated outposts that are holding our cities and our territories in our hands. So I think that now we have a very important role, including in the planning sector, which is decolonizing planning imagination and getting rid of this model development for capital accumulation and nurturing and protecting and promoting those other forms of building landscapes for life. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raquel. That was no less inspiring than the other occasions I've been fortunate to hear you talk. I think, I mean, one of the reasons why I love listening to you and I'm happy that we have you here is that you combine your passion, your conviction, your values with a very robust scientific, if I may say, academic underpinning. I think this is something that, I mean, there are very few people who can bring those two strands together in such a coherent and enlightening way. So I will invite you to take a seat here. We have arranged some chairs to have a panel discussion, and I will invite my colleagues from the TU Delft, Professor Marja Elsinga, to also take a place here. Dr. Nelson Mota, yes, from architecture, and last but not least, Roberto Rocco from urbanism. First of all, I forgot to mention that we are lucky to have the Global Urban Lab filming this event. So it will be online in their website and also in our collab research website, which is the research group that I lead at the faculty at the Department of Management and Built Environment. Again, the resistance to new ways of building housing commons or cooperative housing. So I'm very, very happy that you finished on a positive note, saying what can we do about it as citizens, as people, right? It's all not doom and gloom. I would hope. But well, of course, we have here some household names. We know what each of these colleagues work on, and I thought it would be very interesting to have a discussion on Raquel's book and talk from the different perspectives that each of us works on in the field of housing, urbanism, planning, and also, as I said before, looking across the regions of the world, because we have this global north, global south divided. Many of us don't agree it strictly applies, right? But it's a way, basically, of trying to make sense of the colonial past, right? And what is the legacy of the colonization in different parts of the world. But we see now, as you clearly explained, that there are overarching processes. There are global forces that are actually having similar effects. So perhaps let's start with Marja, who is now leading a very interesting initiative in our faculty, the 1 Million Homes, how shall we call it, program or initiative?
Initiative.
Yes. So Marja, could you please tell us your initial reactions to Raquel's address? And I have 2 microphones. This is one, and the other one, maybe you can pass it around. Yes. You need to press the mic. Okay, it works.
Okay, thank you, Nelson. Thank you very much, Raquel. This was indeed a very inspiring talk. Also a bit a sad talk. How could this happen? I mean, I'm from the Netherlands, and here in the Netherlands we had a social housing model which worked quite well and had huge societal support. And then you have this movement, this animal, and even the Dutch social housing model was destroyed by it. And then I was wondering how to continue from here. What can we learn from this, and how can we continue with our global urban lab? I mean, it's about housing, it's about quality of life. And I think it is important to go back in history. I mean, in Europe there were many housing acts introduced during the industrialization, 1901 in the Netherlands. It was introduced by a liberal-led government. And then you wonder, why did it happen then? Why was housing on the agenda? It was on the agenda because there was a broad awareness that housing is important for people, is important for health, is important for access to society. So there was the idea that housing is important. Not only for those who have problems to pay for it, but also for the rest of the population. If you have a sound living environment, it's important for all, the whole population, also for the political elite. I think that's interesting to remember. For now, we are searching with the Global Urban Lab, with the Luz Maria, about where are we now, what is the ambition in the world, housing at the center of urban development, from Quito. But what does that mean? How can we implement this? What can we do as Delft University, as researchers, as academic community? So I'm thinking about how to put housing on the agenda, how to make clear to a broad population that it is important. And also to learn how could this happen. You are quite critical about home ownership as a vehicle for financialization. I share the critique. But I think also, how could that happen? That is private ownership. I've done a lot of research here in Europe, interviewing people, individual people, poor people owning a house, what that means to them. And it is a basic security. People like it. People like home ownership, not because of the mortgage, but it makes them independent. And it is the ultimate security in times of financial problems. And I think that feeling of basic security among the people. You mentioned in the UK how this policy got support from the Labour Party. I mean, this notion of security attached to the real estate is important to realize when thinking about the future. And then I will also finish with a positive notion about Dutch social housing. The social housing stock in the Netherlands had brought support because of health in urban renewal, as you say. I mean, in the 70s and 80s, there was broad support for social housing because their task in urban renewal. But then we had the 90s. And I think the most sad thing is that the people, I've been working in housing associations, so there was a belief among the people who were in power in housing associations that this whole financialisation was a good thing. I mean, the language that was spoken was about efficiency. We have a good system, and it was all about how to make the system more efficient. And not think, what is the system about? What was social housing for? What is the contribution to society? And yesterday I talked to some housing associations. They came here for an interview about the future of social housing. And I think it is promising that people in social housing representing the sector, they are wondering now, again, you know, why are we there for in the Netherlands? What is our contribution to society? And we hear sounds of dangerous neighborhoods, of segregation. Of course, this is quite relative in the Netherlands. But it is on the agenda, and the people in social housing are thinking again of what can we do, what is our role in society. How do we organize?
Should I reply?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Good. I think
You have the
I
mic.
have the mic. Thank you very much, Maria, for your observations. I think that the key point that links your first comments with your last ones is that there is no way housing policies can be reformed without mobilization and organization and pressure from the local. Just no way. All the welfare and all the systems that we have in the countries that we have, they were made because of the organization of the workers and the pressure and all that. And of course, the elites, they compromised with those ideas because there was the danger of revolution, of communism coming. And this was very clear in the early decades of the 20th century. Now, the 90s, the communism is over, collapsed. The danger of communism does not exist anymore. So the bedrock for commitment and the idea that wealth, part of the wealth, can be shared and should be shared with the others that don't have, just collapse. So you have massive, massive rise in inequality as a whole. And so this is the dismantling of a whole system of values, and thanks for bringing that. Because when I was in Sweden, that became so clear for me. The whole idea there in social housing was not just brick and mortar, but an idea, an utopian idea of collective living, of community, of communal life, which it's no longer in place. I'm not at all arguing that we have to go back to the policies that were implemented in the 30s, in the 40s. I am not arguing that all modernism was the best thing that happened in the world. I mean, we have a different world, we have to move. And I am not arguing that the state is a very good and efficient manager of housing. It's not. It's not. So I'm arguing for something that is for the new era, it's for digital economy, it's for sharing life, it's for the disappearance of the idea of a working class which is based on factories that doesn't exist, almost doesn't exist anymore in a lot of places. It's a different setting, and we need to have a new utopia on that. And this can come just with the organization of the affected people, and it's a question of generation, I think. I think it's the young generation that now is suffering of this impact, that is trying to see and said, okay, this is not very good, let's go on. One last question on home ownership. Yes, I exaggerated a lot my criticism on home ownership. It's not that home ownership is bad. It's not bad at all. It can be very good. The problem is home ownership as being the one and only model for everybody, everywhere. And using all the public resources and the public means in order to promote that, one. And second, home ownership related, the umbilical cord that relate home ownership with financialization. So I have nothing against that. Can be, again, collective ownership is home ownership as well. It's very secure, it's for life, da, da, da. But we should have a range of different policies in place. And they must, all of them be secure. And not only that, so it's not just against home ownership, but it's against this, I would say, combo that links home ownership with this whole process.
Indeed, the dangerous cocktail, right? It depends how much, it's a nuanced question on ownership. Now, perhaps moving on to one other aspect of your talk in your book, it's interesting also how you connect these topics, housing and financialization, to the shape of the cities and how our urban landscapes are looking. And perhaps this is a nice entry point for Roberto to give his comments.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Raquel, for this wonderful talk. But I asked the permission of the organizers to tell a little story. In 1988, I was struggling to get at the University of Sao Paulo, studying very hard. You know how difficult it is. I didn't get the first time, and I bought this book. It's called What's the City? It's called What's the City by Raquel. And this is one of those books, first steps, like simple explanations on things that we can buy nowadays. And this book was maybe one of your most influential books of all, I would say, because it was cheap to buy. Everybody in Brazil read it. And in this book, you describe the city first as a wonder. So you describe how you are electrified when you are flying over a city. Then you describe the city as this place of work and toil, of people, where people meet. And then at the end of the book, there is a large chapter about the city of capital, and where capital lands. My question to you, based on this experience, is, and you already explained what is different between 1988 and now. You said it's the speed, it's the scale, but were there any surprises between then and now? Has anything surprised you? And my last question is, has democracy failed to protect us from this huge machine that is consuming us, actually, and consuming our cities? Because if you are not aware, let me tell you that in 1988, Brazil had just been re-democratized after 22 years of dictatorship. Ronald Reagan was in the White House in 88. So.
Yeah, thank you, Roberto, and thank you for bringing this little book back. I like the other day it was written in 1985, and the other day I was reading it and I was afraid of, I said, oh my God, what I said there, maybe it's very bad. And I read it, oh, this is so much better than the one that I just read. And I still believe a lot in this book. Again, what is the surprise? Is there a surprise? Yes. Unfortunately, a bad surprise, I would say, because at least in the case of Brazil and the Brazilian experience, we have had a very important urban reform movement and urban reform agenda made of, in which architects and planners had a very important role, and one of the ideas was to promote inclusionary cities for all, and reforming planning and reforming planning practices in a way that we could do that. And we have done serious attempts to do that at local level, at city level first, and then at state, regional level, and then at the national level with government of the Workers' Party, creating a new Ministry of Cities. And one of the dreams with the Ministry of Cities was really to enforce the urban reform agenda. But, surprise, the urban reform agenda was defeated in the Workers' Party government. Maybe other agendas were not. So I'm not talking about every policy in the Workers' Party that had to do with redistribution of wealth, because a lot of others were, yes, able to promote redistribution of wealth, like raising the minimum wage, having a basic income for every family, and other measures like that, inclusionary policies in education, which I think they are very, very important. So I can name a lot of distributive measures that were implemented by the Workers' Party, other agendas that were in place since the 80s, since the struggle for democratization, but not the urban one. The urban one and the housing one. And so, through an example which I developed a lot in the book, the example of the program My House, My Life, which is a huge, a massive program of housing construction accessible for the poor, I give you an example of that. And what is the surprise? For many, many years, housing activists in Brazil, they struggled to have housing subsidies to relate to housing, saying it will be impossible to offer any possibility of access to housing for the majorities through credit. Forget. We need budget money. We need to expand budget money and subsidies directly into housing. Otherwise, it will be impossible. So finally, the government decided to mobilize a huge amount of subsidies to mobilize into housing. Yes, victory, no. Why? Because, again, there was a combo there also. It was subsidies to build a specific product, which is massive construction of housing in the outskirts of the city, in very homogeneous morphologies, built by private entrepreneurs to people to receiving subsidies to buy those products that without receiving the subsidies they will never buy because they are horrible, basically. So it was not housing, it was not subsidies to fund the self-management initiatives of cooperative housing of social movements. It was not subsidies to fund, to renew squatter buildings in downtown areas and the city center in order to provide adequate housing for all. It was not money to upgrade settlements and do transformation in settlements and ameliorate homes. It was not for that. It was not to provide rental schemes, protected rental schemes for those who are very, very low income. So it was, yes, a lot of subsidies, but surprise, not to do what you think should be done, but to do what the financial capital thinks should be done. So I think that happened all over the places. That happened with labor in UK, that happened with the Socialist Party in Spain, who was also responsible for implementing this housing massive boom because of the political economy of housing. So I think that we, in a way, were, and I say myself, in my own trajectory, very naive on thinking on the possibilities of having these instruments, and we didn't realize how much the whole new thinking of neoliberal urban policy was penetrating in Brazil in the 90s. We were very engaged in trying to do new things, but at the same time, this new thinking was really penetrating and then got hegemony in public policy and cultural minds, architecture schools, and all that. So I think now it's a time to rethink including the strategies and the instruments, and to rethink how we can, knowing that, rethink all the resistance tactics that we were employed. Having said that, I think that one of the lessons learned by this democracy that failed completely, and it's not just there. Democracy is in crisis everywhere. I think that this liberal model of organizing space, society, life, culture, and politics is in crisis. The environmental crisis is a sign of that. The cultural crisis is a sign of that. The political crisis. Who really believes in those democracies that we have? So I think we are living through a big crisis. And the lesson learned that we learned during these times is that we really thought that the best way to change cities and lives was to draw public policies and get power inside government to do that. And we put a lot of our energy on that, looking inside governments. And we just lost the ties with society. And in the case of Brazil, society was taken by neoliberal culture in this meantime. So now what I see is much more a movement on the base, on trying to retake links, on reorganize, on doing, instead of setting up an agenda to gain the government to implement the agenda, to follow the agenda, we just do the agenda right now. We just struggle and as a kind of prefiguration of a new agenda. I think this is the new movement that is coming.
Thank you. I think the question of social movements and the resistance, as you point out, it's very strong in the environment. We see that clearly.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in housing, what I personally see is there are places where, there's a lot of citizen action, concerted action to try to reclaim, especially where the housing crisis is worst, right? Places like Spain, some parts of the UK to a certain extent, and in Latin America, as far as I know. But there are other countries where people seem to be asleep still. I mean, and we've had this discussion also in our department. And Marja, you are Dutch, and we have been talking about why is Dutch society not to the possibility of citizens taking the lead on housing provision. So maybe I leave that for a question also to discuss with the audience, because we will have the opportunity for you to ask questions. But I would like to now give the floor to Nelson. Nelson has been working, as we know, a lot in Africa in particular, also in India, with informality, which is also a topic that Raquel touches in her book, so perhaps you can give us a few thoughts from your perspective.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Darinka. And so, well, thank you, Raquel. I think that, your book, as well as the lecture, are absolutely instrumental to understand, let's say, the status quo of housing policies today and over the last, say, 30 years since this neoliberal turn. But there's also something that, well, your former boss, so to speak, let's say the United Nations, they have these population prospects. And then one of the things that in this report that they state is that by 2050, we will have 2 billion more urbanized. So this means 2 billion more people living in cities. And 90% of these process of, say, urbanization is going to take place in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So even not in Brazil, definitely not in Europe, not in Russia, but, South Asia, meaning India, Bangladesh, all those sort of places, and sub-Saharan Africa. Now, if we think about that, let's say, then, there's a certain urgency, right? This is only 30 years, and we will have all this amount of people, popping out, in our cities, so to speak, and in new towns that will be created. One of the things that we've been confronted with when we work in Ethiopia and in India is that there are some programs emerging over the last, say, 20 years, 10 years, and all of them are indeed very much based on promoting ownership as a lure for the people. But they have also different kinds of, systems of land provision, let's say. In Ethiopia, for instance, all the urban land is owned by the state. In India, it's not, but there are some citizens living in the slums, let's say, they were granted some sort of, kind of titling kind of procedure in which they can, let's say, exert some sort of, ownership on the land that they inhabit. And these programs have always been presented as win-win and sometimes even win-win-win situations. So, for instance, the case in India looks like this. So, if you have a slum in the middle of in the middle of the mainland in Mumbai, the real estate cost there compares with London. But of course, then you have just a slum there. So, how do you, grab that land? So, they came up with this system, the Slum Redevelopment Authority. So, if a developer manages to get 70% of the dwellers agreeing in giving up their land and getting an apartment for free on that same place. They are not going to be evicted to 20 kilometers away. They can get an apartment on that place. Then the developer and the municipality gives them the right to redevelop that land. And so what happens? 25% of the original land, say maybe in the worst corner, you get these huge slums where people move into for free. And then on the remaining 75%, of course, the commercial developer, builds very expensive real estate that he gets, an enormous profit out of it. Now, and then in the case of Ethiopia, so the government developed this program, the Integrated Housing Development Program, in which, let's say, because the land is owned by the state, so they just started, building huge amounts of social housing. And then they created a system in which people, let's say, pay a small amount of the cost, 10%, 20% of the cost of the house, and they get access to this house through a lottery, so you never know where you are going to end up. And then this frees, of course, also the land, in some cases also in prime real estate locations. And then the people for 20 years, they have to pay a loan to the state bank, so in this case, even the state bank. Now, in both cases, and this is what I'm interested in discussing with you, is the relation between housing policies and livelihoods. The life of the people. I know that, banks, governments, and all that, it's very important. We should be very careful about that. But I also think that we should look at cases, at personal cases, at the family. What does this mean to a family? What does the Minha Casa Minha Vida means for a family? How do they live? How do they generate their income? How do they build up social spaces? And how are all these things, let's say, manipulated by this, apparatus of the neoliberal trend, let's say? And I think that we have been looking into a process where the focus is put, let's say, on two key aspects. One is efficiency. You talked about this. There's a huge insistence on efficiency. Governments want to develop efficient housing. I mean, you have, because since all development is going to take place in they have other precious resources, but in terms of money, not so much. And then we need to do something that is efficient. Spend as little money as possible, build as fast as possible. Now, the thing with efficiency is that if you put all your money in efficiency, this creates brittleness, meaning, you create something with, if you just touch a little bit, it breaks up immediately. The other thing that is happening is that it happens in our sort of scholarly environment, but also in housing activists and all that, is putting a lot of pressure in resilience. So always thinking about, look into these, slums, look how powerful they are, look how, we can find them, the clues for a more sustainable way of living. Look at how we can learn so much. I mean, this is the Turner kind of thing, from the 70s, housing by people, fetishizing this kind of informal or spontaneous or whatever you call it, settlements. Now, the thing with this is that this also creates stagnation, right? Because, if you put all your money in resilience, so what do you get out of it? You get a system that maybe, is resilient, can change, twist, and all sorts of things, and in the end, comes back to its initial condition. That's the definition of resilience to a certain extent. Is that also where we want to go? So, all these things considered, my question is, considering that we have 2 billion people to bring into the cities of the, say, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, are we going to manage to cater for this with cooperative housing, with community land trusts and all that, or do we also need something that goes beyond that? These, of course, I think are obviously systems that we should really pay attention to, but is this necessary? Indeed, let's say, the amount, the quantity, if you can put it, the quantitative aspect of it, but also the qualitative aspect of this housing urgency is such that what would be, after your experience, what would be, let's say, the way to go in order to promote, let's say, livelihoods that are more, integrated and more socially just and not so disenfranchised as they are currently?
Just that. It's a whole new lecture to elaborate that, because first of all, I think that although we have been working with so-called informal settlements, the fact that we don't even have a name and we cannot really define it, I think it's a sign of the subdevelopment of our thinking on the ways people are really building their lives. And the logic behind it, it's a logic of survival, but also of prosperity. And we need to understand, and you are absolutely right, it's not just about housing, it's about livelihoods. And that's the big mistake when you enter in a community and you see it as a housing issue, and it's not a housing issue. And most of the problems that we had with Minha Casa Minha Vida had to do with livelihood and cost of living. And also the idea, and I remember one of the incredible experience that I had was with some Indonesian kampungs where life and work, it's together there in the same place, but organized in a way that protects some privacy of home, but at the same time provides a place with scarce resources. Then again, what my question is the problem? The problem is the form, the arrangements, the logic of the livelihood, or the problem is the scarcity of resources, including technical resources. I think the problem is the scarcity of resources. And the question, and this is an old question for us, modernism and planning as a social engineering artifact that goes there not only to provide, with the utopia of providing better ways of life, but it's also destroying ways of life and livelihoods and creating new ones by force, I would say, by forceps. So I believe much more on another idea that we should dig much more on the logic, the culture, the engine, the way, and then try to see how much this can receive much more technical assistance and money and more resources to be better, not only for the existing, then for the new ones, because we need new ones. That's the point that you were saying. So for that issue, I think, we need massive new urbanized areas. Clearly, it's not only a question of ameliorating what we have. We need new ones, and we need a lot. But I think we should invert the equation. I think we should promote, as governments, as policy, developed areas, urbanized areas, and not housing. We don't need to develop housing. We need to develop cities. If you have, and I think there are some interesting experiments, for instance, in Colombia related to that, there are not many, but they are interesting. You invest in creating city with everything, good city, with sidewalks, with trees, with bibliotheques, with a good infrastructure, with places where people can get it. Just that, without the housing. And then, if you do that, the people with technical assistance and some money can build their own house by cooperative or individually as homeowner, or buying for some construction company that offers that. But then you're going to have a very good community, because a good settlement is the one that have the public space very well done, and not necessarily the individual space or the homes. But why we always infer that? Because housing was taken over a long time ago by the construction industry and the banks and the finance industry. That's why, and that's everywhere. If we reverse that, I think that we will be able, with less resources, provide better cities for all. But it's a political question, because the strength and the power of the construction sector and finance is so good, and it's so large, and it has been like that since decades. So how we can face that, how we can overcome that, and the only answer I have is with the power of the people, and saying, we have to go to a new way, and also demonstrating, and that's why one of the reasons why I wrote this book, to demonstrate the failure. The only way we can dismantle that is showing, this didn't work, sorry, let's go to another policy, because this hasn't worked. But I know it's very difficult, because even research, even the think tanks are also much more related to these power chains.
Indeed, this is a very challenging comment you pose to us, because the whole system, including academia, is built along these silos, right? So we specialize as experts or teachers, researchers, and then policymakers and so on. I'm a housing expert, you see. It's like you don't see anything else. But in reality, we do see other things. But the system, the way knowledge and policy formulation is built, in a way leads us to this niche approach. And that works against integration, as you say. But I'm pretty sure most of us in the room, we see things as intrinsically linked, right? But we wish there was a way to realize them in practice like that. And I know Roberto has a burning issue he wants to comment on.
No, it's not a burning issue, but I just wanted to ask you if you think that any of these alternative ways are possible with private ownership of land. So how can we deal with that? Here, the big cities of the Netherlands own their land, but we know that in most places around the world, private ownership is prevalent. Can we do anything?
Well, first of all, it's very important to notice that public ownership of land is very important, not only in Ethiopia, because it's all land, but in the case of Sao Paulo, according to the records, the tax records of the city, the most important property holder of the city is public. It's not private. And so the role that public land has at this moment is very important, not only here, everywhere. And I'm sure this is true also for many, many other places in the global south. And that's why exactly this public land is the one that is being privatized. So if we start to do that with the public land, we don't need to, we don't touch private property. You can go there with private property. But if we start with public property to implement this type of policies, I think that it's a very promising thing. And yes, as a utopia, and we need utopias, I think we should get rid of private property. But this is something to dream, to have in a very large horizon, and to open up for all types of tenure as being equal, important, and powerful, dismantling capitalism completely from its base. But of course, I know that this is, it's not near future, it's not long future, but in this meanwhile, I think that we, instead of privatizing what is public, we should commonize what is public. And if we start like that, and then we're going to have different examples and different ways of living and different possibilities, and then we can demonstrate for the rest of the society that yes, this is possible, yeah, this looks good, yes, this looks better, and then convince for a broader change. So this is more or less my agenda for the next, 100 years.
Thank you, Raquel. I think Maria wanted to say something very briefly, because then I really want to give the floor to the people.
Very short introduction about this 1 million homes. You already mentioned it. This initiative is not about how to build 1 million homes as quick as possible. It is about the housing challenge for the future. It is about research, education, and also what are the underlying values when we talk about the housing challenge. And you mentioned many, many interesting things, but I would like to highlight to combine two things. You say we have to build cities, not housing. I think that is a very interesting message out of the lecture. The other one, you said it needs to come from the next generation. So what is the lesson for education in this faculty? How can you argue that it is important to build cities, not housing, to facilitate it? What is your main message for the students in this building, in this university?
Yeah, I think that what I always say to the students is that your generation, the generation that are the students now, you have the privilege, but also the challenge of reversing things. It's the challenge because, I mean, it would be much more interesting to just let things go and not do anything. But why I'm saying that? I'm saying that because I think that neoliberalism is dead. Is dead in terms of the lack of capacity of neoliberalism to present a response to the environmental crisis, to the political crisis, to the housing crisis. So it's dead, but it's dominant. It's hegemonic. And we are living in a corpse. That's why it's so unpleasant today, life today, I think. But having said that, it's up to us now to start to imagine future. And the old agenda, the agenda of last century, does not help us. The socialist agenda or the communist agenda. Not help us because, I mean, it's not possible anymore. It's another society, it's another time. So we need to build a new one. And this is a privilege. It's horrible because we are living in a world in crisis, and crisis can be very dangerous, as is the rise of fascism that is going on everywhere. It's really something very threatening and horrible and horrifying, but at the same time is a moment of creativity. It's a moment of imagination. So I think that it's very important that my main message is like, just feel free to imagine and get out of the box and rebel against their assignments.
Thank you, Raquel. Okay, now I really want to give you guys the floor. So, okay, we see already some. Can I have the microphone? So we'll pass it around. You say who you are. I mean, student, teacher, from where, and then pass it.
Yeah, I know that example. It's like a different language with the same grammar. And I want to ask you maybe a more general question about, let's say, the neoliberal term, whether you think that home ownership was one of the triggers that enabled that term or not. Because, but I think that in many cases, at least in my research, what I encounter in the context of Israel, is that some parts of society, let's say the well-connected parts of society or privileged, middle class or upper middle class, was able, due to this turn to or focus on home ownership, to transform some of its political or cultural capital into a financial one. And usually, in many cases, this middle class or upper middle class was previously the more socialist or social one that was anti-privatization. So by giving them home ownership, you lured them into neoliberalism, and you were able to create, no, not you, yes, but the regime or the market economy was able to turn them into, say, stakeholders or just shareholders, actually. And by doing that, no one was able to resist neoliberalism anymore. So you have socialist parties that are totally neoliberalism, and I think that most socialist parties in countries where they had neoliberal terms don't have the term socialism anymore. They call it the left or liberal or whatever, but social democracy, but the term socialism or labor, etc., etc. So do you think that home ownership or the focus was one of the things that enabled that or not? Thanks.
I'm a PhD candidate working at the Department of Management of the Built Environment. I'm specialized in land policy and originally from South Korea. So I read your interview article in Korean newspaper a few years ago, and I'm very happy happy to see you here in the Netherlands. Yes. My question is, actually, you picture the whole story of the bad effects or side effects of financialization all over the world. I think, as we can find in the discussion of validated capitalism, still we need to capture what kind of institutional windows or opportunities are there to make the whole financialization process work better for the working class and the poor. I think it's important to think from that perspective, because when I compare the Netherlands and Korea, there are good points and bad points, pros and cons, of course. For example, in the Netherlands, the credit expansion of households is huge because of the 100% of mortgage financing.
Mm-hmm.
But in Korea, the credit expansion is quite suppressed by the government policy, so that the price inflation is quite slowed down in comparison to the Netherlands. But at the same time, South Korea has very bad regulation for rental housing sector. But in the Netherlands, rental housing sector is now, the regulations are lesser and were weakened, but still they are functioning. So it somehow counterbalances the privilege of private home ownership or the private ownership of rental housing. So when we see these dynamics, we still need to think about how to make the already existing fiscal policy and financial institutions better. So can you also, mention about that?
I really liked your final remarks and your stimuli for all the staff and students of this faculty to not forget to imagine. And the fact that you're reminding all of us that we are living in this neoliberal society that has lots of constraints, puts lots of constraints and lots of burdens in ourselves, but at the same time we have this capacity to imagine and to be free. And I have a concern, and actually I was thinking about after you told this sentence. And one of the premises of liberalization is that our society nowadays is built on our desires.
Mm-hmm.
Like, liberalization implies in all of us to desire. And this is what happens if, for example, if we think about Instagram, for example, in which we are constantly seeking for building up an image. And this image is somehow fitted by this desire. And there is the next desire, and the next desire. So how to imagine, and at the same time, do not fall into this trap of liberalization. And how to imagine for this common good, I would ask it to you. Because one of the things I've raised in my research, I did field research in Brazilian favelas for 10 years, and I've observed the fact that livelihood was so important for the residents, self-esteem, decency of life. It was also ordering the spaces of favelas, but then they were transferred to social housing and they started constructing spaces in order to accommodate their working activities. Is the fact that architecture somehow, within this frame of neoliberalization that is constantly building up on desires, is in a certain way stimulating us to design for secondary needs and not for primary needs, and which was something that I raised in my book, actually, about this experience. And so how would you add on that? Thank you.
Gabriel, thank you for bringing that point. I completely agree with you, and more than agree, I can give you some very clear examples, bringing the case of Spain, Chile, and Brazil, where housing authorities, the Ministry of Housing, by the time Spain in under Franco, Chile under Pinochet, and Brazil in the first years of dictatorship, where the National Housing Bank was organized, and it was in those other countries also, was the launching of a national bank to promote home ownership. in all of them, I don't know if it's anecdotal or it's true or not, but all of them we have quotes of the speech of the ministry saying, let's make every worker a homeowner as a political endeavor. Means to really, so then they will not be socialist and organized against and so on. So this was not a hidden agenda, it was an open agenda in many countries. Like really was a way, one of the fundamental ways for liberalism to take over minds. And that comes to a second question, which is very important. We are not, when we're talking about neoliberalism and when we are talking about all those processes, and Nelson has brought a little bit this issue here, we are talking about a biopolitical cultural process. It's changing minds, changing ways of life, re-engineering the way we function, including our desires and the way we dream towards wealth accumulation and towards some values. It's a completely change of values. And homeownership has two different roles on that. One is really is a pillar for that, but the second one is also as a means to increase consumption, because you can use your asset to increase consumption. So it's a will, a very important will, and I agree with you that changed completely the profile of former socialist parties in the West, completely. And specifically in the case of Israel, I didn't tell, but I tell that in the book. I was in Israel to do a mission there, and as a human rights person, everybody was just pushing me towards discussing the Jewish-Palestine conflict and the settlements and all that. But when I was there, some months before, there was a campment in Dizengoff Street made of young people claiming that the housing policy that used to be one of the pillars of Israel's welfare state was dismantled and destroyed, and the youth was not able to get housing anymore. So maybe there is a new cycle again, because of course, for the Israeli pioneers, it's okay, and they became all neoliberal. But there is a new generation first. There is a wave of new immigrants that are not taken care of as they were in the past, being included in social institutions. So I think there is a space also for moving. But again, since it's so important, the cultural and biopolitical side of it, as you mentioned, we have to understand that also at that level. That also helped us to understand what happened, for instance, in Brazil, where one of the Bolsonaro's very fascist new government is a coalition of military and police, violence-related people from very radical neoliberal thinking in economics and of agribusiness, an anti-environmental agribusiness, and evangelic churches, evangelic new Pentecostal churches, which are also super connected with the neoliberal thought. in terms of the values. The main value is not solidarity, is not brotherhood. No, the main value is meritocracy, self-made man, prosperity, and other things like that. So we are really seeing this cultural change from above, but from below as well. On the issue of that you raised on the institutional opportunity, I think you are very right. What I'm seeing, for instance, in Germany now, there is a very important movement to re-regulate rent because it was absolutely dismantled and rental was much more protected, and the same movement is going on in the States, especially in New York, San Francisco, parts of Los Angeles, where rent regulation was very important and it's been eased, and now it's coming back. So what I'm saying is that, I mean, it's not just a matter of changing completely the policy, the institution, but it's also a matter of blocking some specific ways by which financialization is played. So some cities and some cities are trying to control Airbnb, for instance, and they are eventually able to do that. I mean, it's not just the big, huge struggle, but also local institutional building of counter policies that also can help to block some of the ways in which financialization comes, but also, and this is very important, protect and promote liberated space from financialization and alternatives at the same time. So I think this is a very interesting municipal agenda that is coming and is arriving, and we can see that in different cities in Europe and also in Latin America. Again, the design. I think in my talk I was able to show that our need to reframe and decolonize planning and architecture is far beyond neoliberalism. And it's something more deeply embedded in the practice of planning and architecture and its language. It's something that I think we should do not only because neoliberalism and the subject of the subjection of architecture to neoliberalism, but also something that is the inability of architecture and urban planning to really engage with people and their livelihoods in a way that it's impossible, it would be possible to imagine together a new architecture and a new way of life, like the very authoritarian trace of architecture and urban planning, which I think we should, it's an old question, a very old question, and we have a history of insurgent planning, participatory ways. We have a history of a very important movement in the field since the 60s of last century in many places with a lot of lessons learned, but I think that we still need a huge effort, which is not, it's theoretical and it's practical as well. We need more practice and we need more planning theory that goes in this direction. Now, I just tell you a brief story. I teach planning. So I teach mainstream planning. And I feel horrible because I teach mainstream planning and don't believe in it. And I teach it. So finally, I decided to offer, for the first time last year, a new class on insurgent planning for undergraduate and also for the graduate school. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful because a lot of people came and from different places, different disciplines, and everybody was like feeling the same because everybody was in a kind involved in new practice, but with difficulties of framing and naming it and sharing. So I think basically this is the way to go now. And it's very important in the schools that we open this space for this thing. But having said that, it's very important to understand how planning works. So I'm not arguing of not teaching mainstream planning anymore. I'm arguing to learn about that, but also to have avenues to do things very differently.
Thank you very much. And I think we have some budding experiments with insurgent or radical planning. Roberto, I've heard that you are working on that.
Preparing a book.
Aha! So we will be following that up. Huh? So I think that unless someone has some last burning remark or question for any of our speakers, panelists today. Yes, okay. The last one. You go ahead. Say who you are.
Hi, Raquel. Thank you for the presentation, very inspiring, critical. So I also wanted to maybe be a bit more critical towards you and ask, because there's a lot of people that also say that we are living this kind of democratic crisis now, and that it's not only in Brazil that the government is losing connection with the population. But for me to think about the institution that is more disconnected to the population than the UN, it's hard to imagine. So after working there for 6 years, and now not being there anymore, how do you reply to some maybe critical geographers or critical political scientists that say that maybe the world will be better without the UN, where they sometimes push for the status quo and not for progressive change, where they just give the crumbles to some humanitarian work, and in the end, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council keep ruling. So, or how actually us as citizens can engage in the change of the UN. Thank you.
As a consultant, not as a permanent thing, and then related to the High Commissioner of Human Rights, which was the institutional UN base for the work of rapporteurs of my work for 6 years, so then much more engaged with the UN. And unfortunately, I don't have wonderful things to talk about UN. Not at all. UN Habitat became a residual agency that acts like an NGO trying to sell projects to countries to survive as a bureaucracy. And UN Habitat tells a lot of blah, 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 but in fact was also promoting financialisation and was not reacting. The World Bank became, in the 90s and early 2000s, the most important think tank on urban and housing, rather than any UN body or UN Habitat, who really wanted to be one like that, but is not. Of course it's not. So that's my opinion about UN Habitat, and also about the urban agenda, which is something that everyone, oh, the urban agenda. The urban agenda also can be read in a way that promotes financialization. I don't really think that it's something that, because the whole discourse of neoliberalism is very inclusionary. We do that in order to include, basically. So, I mean, it's very tricky, and I really don't believe that will bring any change from that. And the High Commissioner of Human Rights is even more complicated. It's a very small, there's no money, it's always begging for money in order to survive. And it's truly embedded in geopolitical, in the mainstream geopolitical struggles and battles. So it's very little room for new things to emerge. And the position of the countries, they are already established there. So it's very difficult to engage in the Human Rights Council and to change anything inside the Human Rights Council, because the countries come there with a diplomatic representation and they are already beforehand aligned around certain themes, and that's it. That doesn't move. And it's a huge bureaucracy that it's not very efficient to talk about efficiency. And so, and yes, the ruling guys are the ones that are in the Security Council and who do all that. But having said that, it's also true, and we always have this another side of it, that thinking as a rapporteur, what kind of change I could do in my mandate? No change. I have no power to say to the countries, stop doing that, and then the countries will obey me. Never, ever. But the fact that as UN, with the UN logo in my head, I was able to echo the voices of the people who were not heard, including in a newspaper in South Korea that I never knew that I was very important for the people who were suffering there at that particular moment. So, and I had the research, not only the logo, but the resources of UN in order also to help local struggles, to be heard, to be more, to empower those who are not, who has no power, not to change everything, but to help to empower, and then can eventually bring change sometime, somewhere. So I have including an example from Brazil, because of UN and the Human Rights Council, a lot of slum dwellers that were being evicted for the making of Rio de Janeiro and other cities to host sport events, they were able to articulate their feelings in the international arena and so on. So, I mean, this can be used and is used by the people, although in a very residual way. I think it's still important for some people to do. We don't need to be naive and believe too much in this institution, no. But we have to take this institution also as of one of the battlegrounds against neoliberalism.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very interesting final note on which to end our love-hate relationship with these big institutions. Not excluding our own EU, that we have it and we don't know what to do with it, but indeed, looking at it constructively, we can do more to improve.
Did you say our own EU or our own TU?
EU! Maybe also
TU and TU.
Right? Every institution, I mean, there's no perfect institutions, right? Maria is a of institutions and governance, but we need to work with them and try to use them to promote the causes we believe in.
Yeah, and you know, talking about the EU, I realized, and that was one of my surprises, that the EU was one of the most powerful institutions to enforce neoliberal turn in the housing policies in European countries.
Absolutely right.
With the pressure on the Netherlands, pressure Denmark and Sweden and other countries in order for them to reform their housing policy. For me, it was a surprise. Maybe not for you.
Maybe that's another book we can write in cooperation. Well, thank you so much to everyone. It's been a fantastic morning. I hope you have enjoyed it as much as I have, at least. And we have the videos, so people who couldn't be here today can see it. And we have our author here ready to sign copies if you have a copy. And it's so funny because I have a copy of my Spanish copy, and you also have a Portuguese copy, which was the first one. And so maybe we can take a picture. How about that? Can anybody take a picture of us?